The expressions on my son's face when I presented the bank statements from my offshore account after he had taken control of my credit cards during my illness is something I'll treasure for the rest of my days. My name is Catherine Reynolds, and for nearly 20 years, I had quietly built a substantial financial portfolio through my international consulting work, while my children believed I was barely making ends meet on a modest teacher's pension. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us where you're watching from, and if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something even more surprising to share with you. This photograph was taken almost 40 years ago, me at 25, standing with my young son Robert, just 3 years old, outside our tiny apartment in Westbrook. We had just received news that I had been accepted into the International Business Program at the State University. Despite working full-time as a receptionist at an accounting firm to support us after my husband's unexpected departure, I spent countless late nights studying for the entrance exams. The hope in my eyes and the innocent smile on Robert's face made every sacrifice worthwhile. I was raised in a coastal fishing town where my grandmother ran a small import-export business from our front porch. "Always keep something in reserve, Cathy," she would say while teaching me basic accounting. "The world respects what it can see, but your security lives in what remains hidden." That wisdom would prove prophetic decades later in ways I never imagined. I married young to Edward Reynolds, a charismatic sales executive with grand ambitions but unpredictable commitment. By the time our son turned 2, Edward had accepted a job overseas that he claimed would set us up for life. 3 months later, I received divorce papers and discovered he had emptied our joint savings account. At 22, I became a single mother, with a toddler, no financial support, and dreams that seemed impossibly distant. I moved us from our comfortable suburban rental to a cramped one-bedroom apartment closer to my mother, who helped with childcare while I worked and studied. With my grandmother's business sense guiding me, I secured a position at Wilson & Associates Accounting while taking evening classes. "Mommy, when will we have our own house?" little Robert would ask, remembering the backyard where he had played. "Someday," I promised, "when I've built something permanent that no one can take away from us." I didn't realize then how that promise would be tested decades later by my own son. My mother provided essential emotional support during those difficult years, but my former in-laws maintained only occasional contact with their grandson. Edward's child support payments were non-existent after he established residence in a country with convenient extradition limitations. There was no safety net beyond my determination and financial intuition. I channeled what little extra money we had into educational opportunities for Robert, sacrificing new clothes and simple luxuries to ensure he had access to good schools, summer programs, and extracurricular activities that would open doors to opportunities I never had. By the time Robert entered high school, my situation had improved considerably. I had completed my business degree with a specialization in international finance, transitioned to an entry-level position at Global Finance Partners, and begun developing a reputation for helping wealthy expatriates structure their international holdings. My modest promotions allowed us to finally move into a small but comfortable house in a better neighborhood. "You've given up too much for me," 16-year-old Robert said one evening, noticing my exhaustion after a particularly demanding week. "Not given up," I corrected him. "Invested. And investments, if managed properly, always yield returns." When Robert was accepted to Westridge University with a partial scholarship, I leveraged my growing financial expertise to cover the remaining costs without burdening him with excessive student loans. Some colleagues thought I was being reckless. At 45, I should have been focusing on my retirement savings, but I had begun developing an alternative strategy that would secure both his future and mine. "I'll pay you back every penny once I'm established, Mom," Robert promised at his graduation, the first in our family to earn a business degree. For a while, Robert seemed determined to fulfill that promise. After securing a position at a prestigious financial firm, he would regularly send checks to help with the mortgage and purchase thoughtful gifts for birthdays and holidays. What he didn't know was that while supporting his education, I had been quietly building something substantial. My expatriate clients at Global Finance Partners had grown increasingly loyal, and I was applying the international tax strategies I'd created for wealthy families to my own modest assets. I lived prudently, saved systematically, and had begun establishing offshore accounts through a private entity called Reynolds International Consulting. My first offshore account was opened in the Cayman Islands when Robert was in his second year of university. It started with just $5,000, nearly all my savings at the time, but it represented something more significant than money. It was insurance against the kind of financial betrayal I had experienced with Edward. Never again, I had promised myself, would I be left vulnerable. By the time I reached 50, I had developed a network of carefully structured accounts in multiple jurisdictions, each one legal but deliberately private. My modest house in Westbrook showed no signs of this growing wealth. I drove a practical 10-year-old sedan and shopped sales at the local department store. To the casual observer, including my son, I appeared to be a middle-class professional, making ends meet, not someone with significant assets in international banking centers. When Robert married Alexandra at 32, he chose a partner who carried herself with the confidence of old money and family connections. I contributed what appeared to be a generous but not extravagant amount to their wedding, though the funds came from just 1 month's interest on my offshore investments, a detail I kept private. The warning signs in our relationship were subtle, at first. During family gatherings, Robert and Alexandra would make remarks about my simple lifestyle or express concern about my limited retirement planning. Robert, especially eager to impress his wife's social circle, began gently questioning my financial choices at their dinner parties, suggesting different investment approaches when I mentioned my conservative savings habits. I observed these changes with quiet concern, but avoided confrontation. My son was building his life. Some adjustment to our relationship seemed natural. Little did I realize how dramatically my position in his world would deteriorate, or how my decision to establish offshore accounts years earlier would completely transform the power dynamics when he pushed too far. But that's where our story truly begins, with a health crisis that arose unexpectedly last year. A crisis that would ultimately lead to that moment in my living room, and the revelation that changed everything between me and my son. The first significant shift in our relationship occurred during Robert and Alexandra's 5th wedding anniversary celebration. They hosted an extravagant dinner party at their newly purchased colonial home in Lakeview Estates. 40 guests, catered gourmet food, a string quartet, and wine that cost more per bottle than my weekly grocery budget. I attended alone, as I had all their social functions since Edward left, having chosen to focus on raising my son and building financial security rather than pursuing new relationships. I wore a simple but elegant navy dress I'd purchased on sale the previous season, appropriate for the mother of the host. As I entered through their impressive foyer, which featured a crystal chandelier that reminded me of the ones I'd seen in my wealthy clients' homes in Europe, Robert greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek. "Mom, you look nice," he said, before adding in a lowered voice, "though you might want to mingle primarily on the patio. Alexandra's investment banker friends are in the main living room, and they're discussing portfolio strategies that might be a bit sophisticated." I nodded pleasantly, swallowing my response that I likely managed more complex international portfolios than most of Alexandra's friends. This subtle redirection had become increasingly common at their gatherings. Gentle suggestions about where I should sit, which guests I should engage with, what topics were appropriate for me to discuss. Later that evening, I overheard Robert speaking to a distinguished-looking couple near the wine bar. "Catherine? Yes, my mother is a wonderful woman," he was saying with practiced charm. "Worked in some financial role before semi-retiring. Simple, conservative approaches. Perfect for her generation, really. She's comfortable, which is what matters." "How thoughtful of you to look after her," the woman replied, glancing sympathetically in my direction. "Family is everything," Robert responded smoothly, raising his glass. "We feel fortunate to be in a position to provide guidance." The irony of his statement would have been amusing had it not revealed how completely he had rewritten our family's narrative. In his version, he was the successful financial expert, graciously including the modestly accomplished mother who had raised him single-handedly and made his education possible in ways he couldn't imagine. These moments multiplied over the next 2 years. Robert began referring to my career at Global Finance Partners in the distant past tense, though I still maintained a select client list. When I offered occasional insights about international tax strategies based on decades of experience, he would exchange glances with Alexandra before steering the conversation toward their own, more current approaches. I maintained my dignity through these small humiliations, reminding myself that their perception of me had no bearing on my actual accomplishments or financial position. But I noticed my invitations to family gatherings becoming less frequent, often limited to occasions where my absence would be conspicuous. My offshore accounts continued to grow during this period. What had begun as a simple self-protection strategy had evolved into a sophisticated financial structure spanning 3 continents. By my 62nd birthday, my international portfolio had grown to just over $2.3 million. All carefully structured, completely legal, but entirely private. Not even my closest friends knew the extent of my assets. This privacy wasn't just about financial security anymore. It had become a form of psychological insurance against my son's increasingly dismissive attitude. Each time he patronized me about retirement planning, I would nod politely, knowing that my offshore assets generated more annual income than he likely suspected I had in total savings. Then came a series of events that began to shift the dynamic, more dramatically. 3 years ago, I decided to retire officially from Global Finance Partners, though I maintained a small consulting practice with 5 long-standing international clients. At my modest retirement gathering, Robert surprised me by announcing he had set up a special retirement account for me, a thoughtful gesture on the surface. "Mom, I've established a conservative investment fund for you," he explained to the small group gathered in the conference room. "Nothing too complex, just stable dividend stocks and municipal bonds appropriate for someone in your position." The account contained $50,000, a generous amount by normal standards, but less than what my offshore accounts generated in monthly interest. Nevertheless, I expressed genuine gratitude for his thoughtfulness, while noting privately that his investment choices were indeed far more conservative than what I had selected for my own portfolio. "I'll check in quarterly to make sure everything is tracking properly," he added, patting my hand. "No need for you to worry about the details." This new role as my financial overseer seemed to satisfy something in Robert. Perhaps it was a genuine desire to help, or maybe it was the satisfaction of reversing our traditional roles. Now he was the provider, the expert, the one making the decisions. I allowed him this illusion, partly from maternal indulgence and partly because it provided useful cover for my more significant financial activities. While he focused on managing this modest retirement account, I was executing a sophisticated currency hedging strategy across my international holdings that would protect against the market volatility I anticipated. Alexandra reinforced this new dynamic, often sending me articles about simplifying finances for seniors, or suggesting user-friendly budgeting apps that even people not comfortable with technology can manage. Each well-meaning gesture carried the subtle implication that I was financially naive and technologically inept, neither of which was remotely true. The situation might have continued indefinitely in this benign, if somewhat patronizing, fashion. Had I not been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer shortly after my 65th birthday, the diagnosis was serious but not terminal. A regimen of surgery, radiation, and hormone therapy offered excellent survival rates. But the treatment protocol would be demanding, with periods of significant fatigue and reduced capacity. When I shared this news with Robert and Alexandra over dinner at their home. Their reaction was immediate and overwhelming. "Mom, you'll need significant support," Robert declared, already reaching for his phone to take notes. "Medical decisions, household management, financial oversight. There's so much to coordinate. I've been managing my affairs successfully for decades," I reminded him gently. "The treatment will be challenging, but I'm perfectly capable of handling my own decisions." Alexandra exchanged a meaningful glance with Robert. "Catherine, cancer treatment is extremely demanding. My aunt went through it last year, and she needed family to manage everything during the worst periods. You shouldn't have to worry about bills and daily decisions on top of fighting cancer." Their concern seemed genuine, and I appreciated their desire to help. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly that concern would transform into control. The following weekend, Robert arrived at my house with a folder of documents and a determined expression. "Mom, I've been thinking about the most efficient way to support you through treatment," he began, spreading papers across my kitchen table. "I've prepared a healthcare proxy so I can communicate with your doctors, a durable power of attorney for financial decisions, and I've set up online access to all your accounts so I can handle bills while you're recovering." The presumption was breathtaking. I hadn't asked for or indicated any need for this level of intervention. "Robert, while I appreciate your concern, this seems premature and unnecessary. I'm undergoing treatment, not becoming incapacitated." "Mom, be practical," he countered, his tone shifting from concerned to authoritative. "What if there are complications? What if the medication affects your thinking? Better to have everything in place before it's needed." We spent the next hour in a carefully restrained discussion, with Robert presenting increasingly urgent scenarios about why I needed his oversight, and me gently but firmly maintaining my autonomy. We finally reached a compromise. I agreed to add him as an authorized user on 2 of my credit cards strictly for emergency purposes, and I would review the healthcare proxy with my own attorney. What Robert didn't realize, what he had no way of knowing, was that the credit cards he now had access to were connected only to my visible domestic accounts. My offshore assets remained completely separate, protected by layers of security and entirely outside his awareness. As I began cancer treatment the following month, I observed a subtle but significant shift in Robert's behavior. What had begun as offers of assistance gradually transformed into assertions of authority. He began questioning my purchases, suggesting I was confused when I couldn't immediately recall a particular transaction, and expressing concern to my medical team about my cognitive clarity whenever I disagreed with his recommendations. The true nature of his intentions became clear one evening 3 months into my treatment. I was resting after a particularly difficult radiation session when I received an alert on my phone, a notification from my bank about unusual account activity. Specifically, a transfer of $45,000 from my primary savings account to a new investment account I didn't recognize. When I called the bank, I discovered that Robert had initiated the transfer using the power of attorney I had never actually signed. He had somehow convinced the bank representative that he had authorization, likely due to his access to my credit cards and his professional demeanor. The realization that my own son had attempted to move my money without my knowledge or consent was both heartbreaking and clarifying. This wasn't just overprotective concern. This was a deliberate attempt to take control of my assets while I was vulnerable. That night, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my attorney, Patricia Winters, a sharp-minded woman who had helped structure my international holdings years ago. The second was to my offshore account manager in Singapore, initiating a sequence of security protocols we had established for precisely this type of situation. The stage was now set for a confrontation I had never wanted but could no longer avoid. My son had crossed a line that required a response, one that would reveal financial resources he had never imagined and overturn the power dynamic he thought he controlled. If you're finding this story relatable, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because in part 3, you'll see how I discovered exactly what Robert was planning to do with my money and the steps I took to protect myself before the final confrontation. The day after discovering Robert's unauthorized transfer attempt, I began what I privately termed Operation Financial Recovery. Despite the fatigue from my cancer treatments, I felt a clarity of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. If Robert was willing to move $45,000 without my consent, what else might he be planning? My first step was to meet with Patricia Winters, my attorney, in her downtown office. Despite my insistence that I could drive myself, she arranged for a car service, one of the few concessions to my condition I was willing to accept. "This is a significant breach of trust," Patricia said after I explained what had happened. Her office, with its mahogany bookshelves and panoramic city views, had been the birthplace of my offshore strategy years earlier. The bank should never have processed that transfer without proper documentation. I'll address that issue separately, but right now we need to focus on protecting your assets from further attempts. I need to understand what Robert is planning, I explained. This doesn't feel like a one-time impulsive decision. The calculated nature of it suggests a larger strategy. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. If you're right, there will be evidence, emails, documents, perhaps conversations with financial advisors. The question is how to access that information, legally and ethically. We discussed various approaches, eventually settling on a two-pronged strategy. Patricia would formally challenge the unauthorized transfer through legal channels, creating a paper trail and putting the bank on notice. Meanwhile, I would conduct a more personal investigation into Robert's intentions. "Be careful, Catherine," Patricia warned as our meeting concluded. "Family financial conflicts can escalate quickly, and your health has to remain the priority." "My offshore accounts remain secure?" I confirmed, though I already knew the answer. "Completely," she assured me. "The multi-jurisdictional structure we created would require significant legal expertise even to locate, let alone access. Those assets are effectively invisible unless you choose to reveal them." That evening, I received a text message from Robert that confirmed my suspicions about his broader intentions. "Mom, noticed some irregular spending patterns on your credit cards. I've temporarily reduced the limits and frozen your savings account for security. Let's discuss a more sustainable budget when I visit tomorrow. No need to worry about any of this." He had moved from requesting control to simply taking it, using my illness as justification. The casual presumption that he could freeze my accounts without discussion was breathtaking. What he didn't realize was that the credit cards and savings account he now controlled represented less than 8% of my actual financial resources. I responded with deliberate meekness. "Thank you for looking out for me. Not feeling my best today. Could we postpone your visit until Saturday? Would give me time to rest." The 2-day delay would provide critical time for the next phase of my investigation. His immediate agreement. "Of course, Mom. Rest is important. Saturday at 10 a.m. works fine." Carried the subtle condescension I had grown accustomed to. The following morning, I contacted Janet Miller, my closest friend and former colleague at Global Finance Partners. Over 30 years of friendship, Janet had been one of the few people who understood my financial strategy without judging it. Now, I needed her expertise in corporate intelligence. "I can't believe Robert would do this," Janet said when I explained the situation over coffee in my kitchen. "He always seemed so principled." "People reveal their true character when they think you're vulnerable," I replied, thinking not just of Robert, but of Edward, all those years ago. "I need to know if this is about genuine concern that's gone too far, or if there's something more calculated happening." Janet, who had risen to become Global Finance's Director of Risk Assessment, before her retirement, nodded with professional understanding. "You need intelligence, not assumptions. What specifically are you looking for?" "Any evidence of financial planning that incorporates my assets. conversations with financial advisors about managing a sudden windfall, property searches, investment, restructuring, anything that suggests he's making plans based on anticipated control of my finances. That's quite an investigation, Janet observed. Are you sure you're up for this during your treatment? This is precisely when I need to do it, I replied firmly. When people believe you're at your weakest, they become careless about covering their tracks. Over the next 36 hours, Janet activated a network of professional contacts while I conducted my own quieter investigation. Years of working with high-net-worth clients had taught me that financial plans leave digital footprints if you know where to look. What we discovered by Friday evening was more disturbing than I had anticipated. Janet arrived at my house with a manila folder and an expression that confirmed my worst suspicions before she spoke a word. "You were right to be concerned," she said, placing the folder on my kitchen table. "This goes beyond overprotective son to something much more calculated." Inside the folder was evidence that Robert had consulted with a financial advisor at his firm about managing a family inheritance situation. The advisor had subsequently developed a comprehensive plan for consolidating approximately $350,000, roughly the estimated value of my house and visible domestic accounts, into a family trust that Robert would control as trustee. More disturbing were emails between Robert and Alexandra, discussing the possibility of selling my house once I was situated in appropriate care. They had already researched several assisted living facilities and calculated how the proceeds from my house sale could fund 5 years of residency in a mid-tier facility. "They've been planning this for months," Janet observed, pointing to date stamps on the emails that predated my cancer diagnosis. The illness just accelerated an existing strategy. The final document in the folder was perhaps the most revealing. A mortgage pre-approval for a vacation property in Coastal Pines, an exclusive beach community I knew Robert and Alexandra had long admired. The down payment amount precisely matched the $45,000 Robert had attempted to transfer from my account. "He was going to use my money to buy a vacation home," I said quietly, the full impact of the betrayal finally registering. "While planning to put me in assisted living." Janet reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry, Catherine." "This isn't what any mother expects from her child." "No," I agreed. "But it's consistent with the attitude shift I've observed over the past few years. The gradual dismissal of my capabilities, the increasing control over where and how I participate in family gatherings, the constant implications that I'm financially naive." "What will you do now?" Janet asked. I closed the folder and sat back, feeling strangely calm despite the evidence of my son's betrayal. "First, I'll secure digital and physical copies of everything we've found. Then I'll consult with Patricia about the legal implications of what Robert has been attempting." "And then?" Janet pressed. "Then I'll prepare for our Saturday meeting, where Robert expects to find his vulnerable mother ready to hand over complete financial control." I smiled for the first time that evening. Instead, he'll meet the woman who has successfully managed international portfolios for 3 decades and who has been anticipating this type of scenario since before he graduated college. That night, I made final preparations for the confrontation I now knew was inevitable. I contacted my offshore account managers in Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and Zurich, instructing them to prepare comprehensive statements reflecting my actual financial position. Patricia arranged for a notary to be available on short notice should I decide to execute any of the revised legal documents we had prepared. Most importantly, I spent time centering myself emotionally for what would be a painful but necessary reset of my relationship with my only child. The evidence suggested a level of calculated self-interest that couldn't be explained away as overprotective concern. Yet beneath my disappointment and sense of betrayal remained the hope that confronting this situation directly might eventually lead to a more honest relationship. Saturday morning arrived with unusual clarity for an October day. I dressed carefully in a simple but elegant outfit that projected capability rather than the frail mother image Robert had constructed in his mind. On my kitchen table, I arranged 3 distinct piles of documents. First, the evidence Janet, and I had gathered showing Robert's plans for my assets. Second, the legal documentation Patricia had prepared asserting my cognitive competence and explicitly revoking any financial authorizations Robert might claim. Third, and most impactful statements from my offshore accounts showing my actual net worth, approximately $2.3 million, or nearly 7 times what Robert believed I possessed. At precisely 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Robert standing on my porch holding a leather portfolio similar to ones I'd seen him use for client presentations. His expression projected professional confidence with a touch of practiced sympathy, the look of someone prepared to take necessary control of an unfortunate situation. What he couldn't possibly anticipate was that this meeting would unfold according to my agenda, not his. The cards he thought were hidden had been visible to me for months, while the true financial strength of my position remained completely unknown to him. I opened the door with a warm smile that momentarily seemed to unsettle him. "Good morning, Robert. Please come in. I've prepared some documents I think we should discuss." His momentary confusion quickly resolved into the slightly patronizing smile I had grown accustomed to. "That's great, Mom, but first let's talk about something important. I've noticed some concerning patterns with your finances that we need to address while you're dealing with your health challenges." "Yes," I agreed pleasantly, leading him to the kitchen table. "Let's definitely discuss concerning financial patterns. Why don't you start by explaining this?" I slid the first folder toward him, the one containing evidence of his vacation home plans and his discussions about selling my house. The color drained from his face as he recognized the documents. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not important," I replied calmly. "What matters is that while I've been fighting cancer, you've been planning to use my money for a beach house while researching assisted living facilities for me. Did I misinterpret anything in those documents, Robert?" He stared at the open folder, visibly struggling to regain his composure. "These were just contingency plans," he finally managed. "Exploring options for your long-term care. The vacation. Property was an investment opportunity that would benefit the whole family." "Including me?" I asked, because these emails specifically discuss timing the purchase with the sale of my house once I'm situated in appropriate care. Your words, not mine. Robert's confident demeanor had completely collapsed, replaced by a defensive posture I hadn't seen since he was caught skipping school at 16. "You don't understand the financial realities, Mom," he insisted, his tone hardening. "Your resources are limited, and I was trying to create the most sustainable plan for your future." "My resources are limited," I repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting assumption. What led you to that conclusion?" "It's not an assumption," he countered, somewhat recovering his professional tone. "I've reviewed your accounts. The house, your savings, the retirement account I set up for you. It's enough for now, but not for potential long-term care if your condition worsens." I nodded as though considering his assessment, then reached for the third folder. "Before we continue this discussion, I think we should establish an accurate picture of my financial position. This might help inform your planning." I opened the HE folder and pushed the offshore account statements toward him. "These are current statements from my international portfolio. I'd particularly direct your attention to the bottom line figures on each one." Robert's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief as he processed the numbers before him. The Cayman Islands account alone held over $900,000. The Singapore and Zurich accounts together represented another $1.4 million, all in his mother's name, all completely unknown to him until this moment. "This can't be right," he whispered, flipping through the statements with increasing agitation. "You don't have this kind of money. You've always lived so modestly." By choice, not necessity, I explained calmly. I've maintained these accounts for nearly 20 years. They represent the international consulting work I've done alongside my visible career, work you've increasingly dismissed as outdated and irrelevant. Robert looked up from the statements, his face a complex mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something that might have been admiration. Why didn't you ever tell me? For the same reason my grandmother taught me to keep something in reserve, I replied. Because financial privacy isn't just about secrecy, it's about security. Given your recent actions, it seems that lesson remains relevant. I reached across the table and closed the folder of offshore statements. I didn't reveal these accounts to embarrass you, Robert. I revealed them because you need to understand that I am not the financially naive, declining parent you've constructed in your mind. I am a woman who has successfully managed complex international portfolios for decades and who remains perfectly capable of making her own financial decisions. Robert sat back in his chair, his planned financial intervention completely derailed. For perhaps the first time since he was a child, he was looking at me not as his mother who needed management, but as Catherine Reynolds, international finance professional with resources he hadn't imagined. The credit cards you took control of, the accounts you froze, they represent less than 8% of my actual assets, I continued. I allowed you that limited access because I believed your concern was genuine, if somewhat overstated. Now I understand it was part of a larger strategy to assume control of what you thought was my entire financial world. It wasn't like that, he protested weakly, though we both knew the documents before us told a different story. Then, what was it like, Robert? I asked quietly. Help me understand how my son, whom I put through college at considerable personal sacrifice, came to view me as a financial resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. That question hung in the air between us, setting the stage for a conversation that would either begin to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth or confirm that the distance between us had grown too great to bridge. If you've ever discovered someone wasn't who you thought they were, hit subscribe and the notification bell, because in Part 4, you'll see Robert's full reaction to learning his mother was worth millions and the unexpected twist that changed our relationship forever. My question about how Robert had come to view me as a resource rather than a person hung in the air between us. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, the ordinary sound a strange counterpoint to the extraordinary moment unfolding in my sunlit kitchen. Robert stared at the offshore account statements, then at the evidence of his plans, and finally raised his eyes to meet mine. The confident financial advisor had vanished, replaced by something more complex, a combination of embarrassment, shock, and calculation that reminded me painfully of his father. I never meant to disrespect you, he finally said, his voice strained. Everything I did was out of concern for your well-being. Including planning to use my money for a beach house? I asked quietly, tapping the pre-approval document. Was that also for my well-being? He flushed deeply. That was a mistake. An opportunity came up, and I thought it could be a family property. Somewhere you could enjoy during your recovery. The justification was so transparent that I almost felt embarrassed for him. Robert, the emails specifically discuss timing, the purchase with moving me to assisted living. Please don't compound your actions with dishonesty. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair, a gesture he'd had since childhood when caught in a difficult situation. I don't know what you want me to say, Mom. Yes, I've been planning for your long-term care. Yes, I saw an opportunity to consolidate family assets in a way that made sense to me. I didn't see it as taking advantage. I saw it as responsible financial management. Without my knowledge or consent, I added. Because you wouldn't have agreed, he exclaimed, frustration, breaking through his professional veneer. You've always been so stubborn about independence, even when it doesn't make practical sense. My independence doesn't make practical sense? I repeated, genuinely curious about his perspective. Not when you're fighting cancer and living alone, in a house too large for one person, he countered. Not when there are excellent care facilities that would provide proper medical supervision. Not when your assets could be better managed through a family trust structure. I listened carefully, recognizing that beneath his self-serving actions lay a worldview that genuinely couldn't comprehend my choices. To Robert, raised in the comfort I had sacrificed to provide, financial resources existed to enhance visible status and comfort. My deliberate modesty, despite having means, must have seemed incomprehensible. "What surprises me most," I said after a moment, "isn't that you developed these plans. It's that you assumed I was financially naive enough not to notice or stop you." He gestured at the offshore statements. "Clearly, I underestimated you in many ways, but you have to admit, Mom, you deliberately created that impression. Living in this modest house, driving a 10-year-old car, shopping sales. What was I supposed to think?" "Perhaps that I valued financial security over appearances," I suggested. "That I made conscious choices about how to live rather than spending. To my maximum capacity? These aren't signs of financial naivety, Robert. They're indications of financial discipline." "Which I respect," he insisted, leaning forward with renewed confidence. "But now that I understand your full financial position, we can develop a much more comprehensive strategy. These offshore structures are fine, but there are more sophisticated approaches we could—" "Stop," I interrupted, raising my hand. "This is exactly the problem. You're still seeing this as a financial management issue when it's actually about trust and autonomy. Even now, knowing that I've successfully managed millions in international accounts for decades, your instinct is to tell me how to better manage my money." His expression registered genuine confusion. "But financial management is what I do. It's how I can help you." "I don't need that kind of help," I said firmly. "What I needed was a son who respected my capabilities and choices, who asked questions instead of making assumptions, who offered support without demanding control." Robert fell silent, the reality of his position finally sinking in. The documents spread across the table told a story he couldn't reinterpret or explain away. His carefully constructed narrative of the financially naive mother needing protection had collapsed entirely, leaving him without the script he had planned to follow. "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than before. I reached for the second folder, the one containing the legal documents Patricia had prepared. "First, I'm formally revoking your access to my credit cards and accounts, effective immediately. Patricia has already filed paperwork with the bank regarding your unauthorized transfer attempt." Robert winced but nodded. "Second, I'm establishing a clear legal record of my cognitive competence and financial independence. These documents," I continued, opening the folder, "include assessments from my oncologist confirming that my treatment has no impact on my decision-making capacity." "Is that really necessary?" he asked, looking genuinely hurt. "I never questioned your competence." "Your actions suggest otherwise," I replied calmly. "Especially your comments to my medical team about my cognitive clarity whenever I disagreed with you." He had the grace to look ashamed at that. "As for our relationship moving forward," I continued, "that depends largely on you. Today has revealed a significant breach of trust that can't simply be dismissed. Rebuilding will require time and demonstrable changes in how you approach our relationship." "I'm still trying to process all of this," Robert admitted, gesturing at the offshore statements. "Finding out my mother has secretly been a millionaire for years is a lot to take in. I imagine it's similar to how I felt discovering my son was secretly planning to sell my house and control my assets," I replied evenly. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of revelations and shattered assumptions filling the space between us. I felt strangely calm, despite the confrontation. There was a certain relief in having everything exposed, in no longer maintaining the careful facade I had constructed over the years. "I have one question," Robert said finally. Why did you live like this? If you had all this money, why did you choose such a modest lifestyle? Why didn't you enjoy it more? The question was revealing. It reflected the fundamental difference in our financial philosophies that had contributed to this situation. Who says I haven't enjoyed it? I countered. Financial security has given me something far more valuable than luxury purchases or status symbols. It's given me freedom and peace of mind. The knowledge that I would never again be vulnerable to someone else's financial control, as I was, with your father, has been worth far more to me than any beach house or luxury car. Robert absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. I never considered that perspective, he admitted. In my world, wealth is about what you can acquire, the lifestyle you can maintain. In my world, I replied, wealth is about what you can withstand, the setbacks you can survive, the independence you can maintain. For perhaps the first time in our adult relationship, I saw genuine consideration in my son's eyes, not the patronizing indulgence of someone humoring outdated ideas, but actual reflection on a different perspective. Our conversation continued for another hour, moving from the initial confrontation to a more nuanced discussion. Robert's defensiveness gradually gave way to reluctant acknowledgement of how his actions appeared from my perspective. I, in turn, explained more about why I had maintained such privacy around my finances, acknowledging that my secrecy had contributed to his misperceptions. I'd like to understand more about these offshore structures, he said toward the end of our conversation, his tone different now, less the advisor offering expertise and more the son showing interest in his mother's work. Not to manage them for you, he added quickly, seeing my expression. Just to understand what you built. It's impressive, Mom. Truly. It was the first genuine compliment he had offered about my financial acumen in years, and despite everything, it touched me. Perhaps we can discuss that someday, I allowed, when trust has been rebuilt. As Robert prepared to leave, he paused at the door. What will you tell Alexandra? About the accounts, I mean. The weeks following my confrontation with Robert brought changes I couldn't have anticipated. My cancer treatments continued, with the expected physical challenges, but the emotional landscape had shifted dramatically. Instead of battling my son's attempts to control my finances, I found myself navigating a new dynamic, one where my financial expertise was suddenly acknowledged, even respected. Robert's immediate response had been to withdraw completely from my financial affairs. The credit cards were returned, account access revoked, and financial documents promptly delivered to my attorney. This abrupt retreat might have seemed like progress, but I recognized it as a defensive reaction rather than genuine growth. He was embarrassed and uncertain how to proceed, so he chose distance. Alexandra, however, took a different approach. After her surprising initial visit, she began stopping by regularly, ostensibly to check on my well-being during treatment, but increasingly, to engage in conversations about financial philosophy. I've been thinking about what you said, she commented during one such visit, helping me prepare a light lunch after a morning treatment session. About wealth being what you can withstand rather than what you can acquire. It's made me question a lot of my family's attitudes. I glanced at her curiously as I took a seat at the kitchen counter. In what way? My parents measure success entirely by external markers, she explained, slicing vegetables with practiced precision. The right address, the right schools, the right social connections. Financial security was assumed rather than discussed. Many families approach wealth that way, I acknowledged, especially when it's inherited rather than earned. Alexandra nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly it. My family's wealth goes back 3 generations. No one talks about how it was built or maintained, only how it should be displayed. This insight into Alexandra's background helped explain some of her previous attitudes. Her dismissiveness toward my modest lifestyle hadn't been solely about status seeking. It reflected the only framework for wealth she had ever known, Robert and I have been having some difficult conversations, she continued, arranging the food on plates. About our priorities, our spending habits, our assumptions about status and security. I imagine those conversations aren't easy, I said. Carefully. They're not, she admitted with a wry smile. Especially for Robert. Finding out his supposedly financially naive mother has been quietly managing millions across international portfolios has challenged his self-image. I couldn't help but smile at her candid assessment. That wasn't my intention in revealing the accounts, I clarified. I only wanted to protect what I had built. I know, Alexandra replied, surprising me with her insight. But the revelation has been valuable nonetheless. It's forced both of us to reconsider assumptions we didn't even realize we were making. This unexpected alliance with Alexandra developed gradually over the following months. While Robert maintained a polite but somewhat distant relationship, Alexandra became increasingly engaged in understanding my financial journey. She asked thoughtful questions about how I had structured my offshore accounts, what strategies I had employed to grow them, and most importantly, the thinking behind my choices to live modestly despite having means. I've never considered privacy as a financial strategy, she remarked during one of our conversations. In my world, wealth is something to be signaled, not concealed. Privacy creates options, I explained, drawing on decades of experience with high net worth clients. When people don't know what resources you have, they interact with you based on who you are rather than what you possess. This perspective seemed to resonate deeply with Alexandra, who had grown up in a world where wealth defined social interactions. Our conversations gradually expanded beyond finance to broader life philosophies, creating a connection I had never anticipated with my status-conscious daughter-in-law. My relationship with Robert remained more complicated. 6 weeks after our confrontation, he finally requested a meeting to discuss family finances in a more constructive way. I agreed, curious about his approach now that the initial shock had worn off. We met at a quiet cafe near the hospital, after one of my treatment sessions. Robert arrived precisely on time, dressed more casually than usual in a simple button-down shirt rather than his typical suit. The subtle change in presentation didn't escape my notice. It suggested a deliberate step away from the polished financial advisor persona he typically projected. "How are the treatments progressing?" he asked after we had ordered coffee, genuine concern evident in his voice. "As expected," I replied honestly. "Challenging but effective. The prognosis remains positive." He nodded, seeming unsure how to transition to his actual purpose. I decided to help him along. "I assume you wanted to discuss something specific today," I prompted gently. "Yes," he acknowledged, straightening slightly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our conversation about the offshore accounts, about my attitude toward your financial decisions, about the assumptions I've been making. And?" I encouraged when he paused. "And I owe you a genuine apology," he said, meeting my eyes directly. "Not just for the actions I took, which were clearly inappropriate, but for the entire mindset behind them. I've been patronizing you for years, Mom, treating your financial knowledge as outdated and limited when in reality, you've built something I never even imagined." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt something tight within me begin to loosen. "Thank you for acknowledging that," I said simply. "I've also been reflecting on why I didn't see it," he continued. "How I could have so completely misinterpreted your circumstances and capabilities." "And what conclusions have you reached?" I asked, genuinely curious about his self-reflection. "That I confused modesty with limitation," he replied thoughtfully. "That I equated visible spending with financial sophistication. That I projected my own values onto your choices and found them lacking, when in reality, they represented a completely different but equally valid approach to wealth." His insight surprised me. I had expected some acknowledgement of overstepping boundaries, But this level of philosophical reassessment suggested Alexandra wasn't the only one engaged in serious reflection. "I've also realized," he added with visible discomfort, "that there was an element of convenience in seeing you as financially naive. It positioned me as the expert, the protector, rather than acknowledging you as someone who might actually have wisdom to offer." This admission, that his dismissive attitude had served his ego as much as his concern, represented significant growth. "That's a difficult thing to recognize about yourself," I observed. "I appreciate your honesty." Robert nodded, seemingly relieved by my response. "I have a proposal," he said after a moment. "Not about managing your money or making decisions for you," he added quickly, "but about creating a different kind of financial relationship between us." "I'm listening," I said cautiously. "I'd like to learn from you," he stated simply. "About your approach to international finance, about how you structured your offshore holdings, about the philosophy that guided your decisions. Not to interfere, but to understand a perspective I've clearly been missing." His request surprised me. After years of dismissing my financial knowledge, Robert was now asking me to become his teacher. "That's quite a reversal," I observed. "Yes," he agreed with a small, self-deprecating smile. "But recent events have made it abundantly clear that I have blind spots in my financial thinking. Who better to help me identify them than someone who successfully built a multi-million-dollar portfolio while I thought she was barely managing a teacher's pension?" Put that way, his request made perfect sense. Still, I hesitated, wary of potential hidden agendas. "What exactly are you hoping to gain from this exchange, Robert?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "Professionally, a broader perspective on wealth management that goes beyond conventional approaches. Personally," he paused, searching for words, "a better understanding of my mother as a financial professional rather than just as a parent." His answer seemed genuine, but I still had concerns. "And my offshore accounts? They remain entirely under my control?" "Absolutely," he confirmed without hesitation. "This isn't about management or control. It's about education and, frankly, rebuilding trust by acknowledging your expertise rather than undermining it." Over the following months, as my cancer treatments progressed toward their conclusion, an unexpected mentorship developed between us. Once a week, usually after my less intensive treatment sessions, Robert would join me at my house for what we came to call financial philosophy seminars. I would explain aspects of my international portfolio strategy, and he would ask thoughtful questions that reflected genuine interest rather than evaluative judgment. What surprised me most was how much Robert had to unlearn. His formal financial education had been entirely focused on visible wealth management, maximizing returns, optimizing tax structures, building impressive portfolios that signaled success. The concept of deliberate financial privacy as a strategic choice, rather than mere secrecy, was entirely new to him. It never occurred to me that maintaining a modest, visible profile could be a deliberate financial strategy rather than a limitation, he admitted during one of our discussions. "In my world, clients want their wealth to be evident in their homes, their vacations, their affiliations." "Different objectives," I explained. "Your clients seek status through visible consumption. I sought security through careful privacy." These conversations gradually expanded to include Alexandra, creating a three-way dialogue that would have been unimaginable before my cancer diagnosis. Her perspective as someone raised with generational wealth complemented Robert's professional expertise and my practical experience, creating richly textured discussions that benefited all of us. 6 months after our initial confrontation, as my treatments were concluding with positive results, an unexpected opportunity arose that would test our new relationship. Robert arrived for our weekly discussion with an unusual request. "I have a client situation I'd like your perspective on," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "It involves international holdings similar to your offshore structure, but with some concerning irregularities." What kind of irregularities? I asked, professional interest immediately engaged. Patterns that suggest potential compliance issues across jurisdictions, he explained, careful not to violate client confidentiality while conveying the general problem. The structures were established decades ago under different regulatory environments, and I'm concerned they may not meet current standards. And you're wondering how to address this without triggering unnecessary scrutiny or penalties, I surmised, familiar with the challenges of maintaining older international structures in an evolving regulatory landscape. Exactly, he confirmed, visible relief in his expression. I thought your experience managing compliant offshore accounts through multiple regulatory changes might provide insights my conventional training hasn't covered. What followed was a 3-hour professional consultation that transformed our relationship yet again. Robert presented the technical details of the situation, with identifying information removed, and I offered strategic approaches based on decades of international experience. We examined regulatory nuances, compliance pathways, and restructuring options with the focused precision of colleagues rather than the fraught dynamics of parent and child. When we concluded, Robert sat back with an expression of genuine admiration. That was remarkable, Mom. The depth of your knowledge, the practical applications, the strategic thinking. It's at a level I rarely encounter even among our firm's senior advisors. His acknowledgement, delivered as one professional to another rather than as a son humoring his mother, represented the culmination of our 6-month journey from patronizing dismissal to genuine respect. Thank you, I replied simply, accepting the professional recognition I had never sought from him, but nevertheless appreciated receiving. I have a proposition, Robert said after a moment's consideration. One that might benefit both of us, if you're interested. Go on, I encouraged, curious about this new development. My firm has been trying to expand its international client services, but we've struggled to find advisors with practical experience in compliant offshore structures, he explained. Would you consider consulting with us on a limited basis? Strictly advisory, completely on your terms, with full recognition of your expertise. The offer was unexpected but intriguing. A professional opportunity I hadn't anticipated at this stage of life, emerging from the very relationship that had once dismissed my capabilities. I'd need to complete my recovery first, I said thoughtfully, and I'd want any arrangement to be formally structured through Patricia to ensure appropriate protections. Of course, Robert agreed immediately. This would be a legitimate professional engagement, not a family accommodation. As I considered his proposal, I realized how dramatically our relationship had transformed. From Robert taking my credit, cards, and attempting to control my finances to now seeking my professional guidance for his firm, the reversal was both ironic and deeply satisfying. I'll think about it, I promised, neither accepting nor rejecting the offer immediately. It's an interesting possibility. Later that evening, as I reflected on this new development, I realized that my offshore accounts had ultimately provided value far beyond financial security. They had become the catalyst for rebuilding my relationship with my son on a foundation of genuine respect rather than patronizing concern, and for creating an unexpected connection with my daughter-in-law based on shared interest rather than obligation. My grandmother's wisdom about keeping something in reserve had proven prophetic, in ways neither of us could have imagined. The financial privacy she had advocated had protected not just my assets, but ultimately my dignity and autonomy when I was most vulnerable. 1 year after my confrontation with Robert, I sat in the elegant conference room of Westridge Financial. Advisors, presenting a comprehensive overview of compliant offshore structuring to the firm's senior leadership team. At 66, cancer-free and more professionally engaged than I had been in years, I had accepted Robert's offer to serve as a specialized consultant, with carefully defined boundaries and a formal contract negotiated through Patricia. The key to maintaining compliant international structures, I explained to the attentive group of financial professionals, isn't just technical knowledge of regulations. It's understanding the underlying purpose of those regulations and aligning client objectives with that purpose. From my position at the head of the conference table, I could see Robert seated among his colleagues, nodding with genuine interest. The transformation in his attitude from a year earlier was remarkable. Gone was the patronizing tolerance for his mother's outdated financial knowledge. In its place was professional respect, not granted as a courtesy to a parent, but earned through demonstrated expertise. Mrs. Reynolds, your perspective on cross-jurisdictional compliance is refreshingly practical, commented Eleanor Winters, the firm's managing partner. Most consultants we've engaged approach these issues from a purely technical standpoint without this strategic overlay. Compliance isn't just about avoiding penalties, I replied. It's about creating sustainable structures that can adapt to evolving regulatory environments while maintaining their core purpose. This consulting role had emerged organically from the initial discussions with Robert about his challenging client situation. What began as informal advice had developed into a part-time professional engagement that allowed me to share decades of practical experience while maintaining complete independence from family complications. The firm's leadership had initially been skeptical about bringing in the mother of one of their advisors, a potential nepotism concern, until they reviewed my credentials and background. My quiet career managing complex international portfolios, once revealed, proved surprisingly impressive. What I had viewed as simply doing my job well for decades had, in fact, built a track record that commanded professional respect. As the meeting concluded and the team filtered out with appreciative comments, Robert lingered behind, an expression of quiet pride on his face. "You know," he said with a thoughtful smile, "I keep waiting for the novelty to wear off, watching my mother expertly advise a room full of senior financial professionals, but it hasn't yet." I gathered my presentation materials, pleased by his comment but careful not to overstate its significance. Our relationship had improved dramatically, but rebuilding trust was a gradual process, not a single transformative moment. The novelty might wear off sooner if you'd realized earlier that your mother actually understood finance, I replied with a gentle humor that took the sting from the words. Robert laughed, acknowledging the truth in my observation. Fair point. Though in my defense, you were extremely skilled at maintaining the appearance of modest means and limited financial sophistication. A skill your current clients might benefit from learning, I suggested, referencing our ongoing discussions about visible versus actual wealth. Financial privacy has advantages beyond tax efficiency. As we left the conference room together, I reflected on how dramatically our professional dynamic had evolved. Robert no longer attempted to guide or manage my financial decisions. Instead, our interactions had developed into a collaborative exchange where my experience complemented his formal training. The power imbalance he had tried to establish during my illness had been not just corrected, but fundamentally transformed. This transformation extended beyond our professional interactions to reshape our personal relationship as well. Our weekly financial discussions had gradually expanded to include broader life topics, creating space for the kind of authentic connection that had been missing for years. Robert spoke more openly about his career pressures, his marriage challenges, his parenting concerns, not seeking guidance necessarily, but simply sharing with a mother he now viewed as having wisdom worth considering. The most significant change, however, emerged in Robert and Alexandra's approach to their own financial life. 6 months after beginning our financial philosophy discussions, they made a decision that would have been unthinkable before my illness. They sold their impressive colonial home in Lakeview Estates. "We realized we were house poor," Alexandra explained during a Sunday dinner at my home, where we had begun gathering monthly. "Beautiful address, prestigious neighborhood, but the mortgage and maintenance were consuming resources that could be directed toward actual security." They purchased a smaller, though still very comfortable home in a less prestigious but pleasant neighborhood, investing the substantial equity difference in long-term growth assets rather than visible status markers. Mom's approach made us rethink our entire financial structure, Robert acknowledged, referencing our many discussions about security versus status. We're still maintaining an appropriate lifestyle for my position at the firm, but with a completely different underlying philosophy. This shift in their financial thinking represented more than practical adjustments. It reflected a fundamental reassessment of values and priorities. What had begun as my defensive revelation of offshore accounts to protect my assets had catalyzed a multi-generational reconsideration of wealth's purpose and management. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome of this transformed relationship emerged during a routine consulting session at Westridge Financial. After discussing a particularly complex client situation involving multi-jurisdictional holdings, Robert approached me with an unusual personal request. "Mom, I've been thinking about something important," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Alexandra and I are expecting our first child." "That's wonderful news," I exclaimed, genuinely delighted. They had been married for nearly 8 years, and I had begun to think they might not choose to have children. "Yes, we're very excited," he confirmed with a broad smile. "And it's made us think deeply about what kind of financial foundation we want to establish for the next generation." I nodded encouragingly, curious where this conversation was heading. "We've been so impressed by the security and independence your offshore structures have provided," he continued, "that we've been wondering if something similar might be appropriate to establish for our child's future." The request surprised me. After years of dismissing my financial approach as outdated and overly cautious, Robert was now considering implementing similar strategies for his own child. "That's a significant shift in thinking from your previous approach," I observed carefully. "It is," he acknowledged with a self-deprecating smile. "But your offshore accounts demonstrated something powerful during your illness. Financial structures that exist completely separate from external pressures or control. That kind of independence seems like an invaluable gift to provide for our child's future. With appropriate modernization for current regulatory environments," I added, always mindful of compliance considerations. "Of course," he agreed quickly. "That's why we're approaching you for guidance. Not to manage it for us, but to help us understand the philosophical framework that should guide these decisions." This request represented the ultimate validation of my financial approach, not just acknowledgement of its effectiveness, but adoption by the very person who had once dismissed it. More importantly, it created an opportunity to extend my grandmother's wisdom about financial independence to yet another generation. Over the following months, I worked with Robert and Alexandra to design a prudent financial structure for their expected child, not an exact replica of my offshore accounts, which had been established in a different regulatory era, but a modern interpretation of the core principles: security, privacy, independence, and long-term growth outside the pressures of consumption and status competition. "The most important element isn't the technical structure," I explained during one of our planning sessions. "It's the philosophy behind it. Financial resources should provide options and resilience, not just purchasing power." Alexandra, who had grown increasingly engaged in these discussions, nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what was missing from my family's approach to wealth. Everything focused on what money could buy, not what it could prevent or protect against." As we refined the details of their plan, I found myself sharing stories about my grandmother that I had never thought to tell before. How she had maintained her small import-export business through economic downturns that bankrupted larger companies. How she had established hidden reserves that protected her independence when others tried to leverage her vulnerable position. How she had taught me that true financial sophistication often looked like modesty to external observers. "She sounds remarkable," Alexandra commented during one such recollection. "I wish I could have known her." "You would have appreciated each other," I replied, realizing the truth of this statement. Despite their different backgrounds, both women shared a pragmatic approach to navigating complex systems while maintaining their essential independence. When their daughter, Catherine Reynolds, was born 8 months later, Robert and Alexandra had established a modest but carefully structured financial foundation that embodied the principles we had discussed. Unlike typical gifts or trusts focused on education or first homes, this foundation emphasized flexibility, independence, and long-term security across multiple jurisdictions. Protection against uncertainties none of us could predict in her lifetime. "We want her to know about this foundation early," Alexandra explained as we finalized the arrangements, "but not access it until she demonstrates financial responsibility, not as a control mechanism, but to ensure she understands its purpose before utilizing it." "Financial education before financial resources," I agreed, impressed by how thoroughly they had integrated these principles. Exactly the approach my grandmother took with me. On Grace's first birthday, a small family celebration at their new home provided an opportunity to reflect on the extraordinary journey of the past 2 years. From my cancer diagnosis and Robert's attempt to control my finances to a transformed family dynamic, and now a new generation benefiting from these hard-earned lessons, the path had been neither straight nor easy, but ultimately led to a place of unexpected harmony. "I've been thinking," Robert said as we watched little Grace exploring her birthday gifts with determined concentration, "about what might have happened if you hadn't established those offshore accounts years ago. I would have been significantly more vulnerable during my illness," I acknowledged. The reality of that alternative scenario still sobering to consider. "Beyond that," he continued thoughtfully, "without that confrontation, without the revelation of your financial expertise, I might never have questioned my assumptions about wealth management, about your capabilities, about our entire approach to financial security. Sometimes difficult revelations create necessary growth," I observed. "They certainly did in this case," Alexandra added, joining our conversation. "Discovering your offshore accounts didn't just protect your assets, Catherine. It ultimately changed our entire family's financial future." As I looked around at this scene, my son and daughter-in-law who had moved from dismissive condescension to genuine respect, my granddaughter who would grow up with both financial resources and financial wisdom, the transformed relationships, built on authentic recognition rather than prescribed roles, I realized that my grandmother's advice about keeping resources in reserve had yielded dividends far beyond money. "The world respects what it can see," she had told me long ago, "but your security lies in what remains hidden." That principle had protected me when I was most vulnerable, had revealed the true nature of my relationship with my son, and had ultimately created space for something more authentic to develop. When I was diagnosed with cancer at 65, my son took my credit cards and attempted to control my finances, never suspecting that I had built substantial offshore accounts over decades. That revelation changed everything between us, not just protecting my assets during illness, but ultimately transforming our entire family's understanding of wealth, security, and respect. I look back now at 67, cancer-free and professionally, engaged with a relationship with my son built on mutual respect rather than prescribed roles, and I recognize the profound truth in my grandmother's wisdom. True financial independence isn't just about having resources. It's about having resources that remain entirely under your control, especially when you're at your most vulnerable. 2 years have passed since that pivotal moment when I revealed my offshore accounts to my son. As I celebrate my 67th birthday today in perfect health, surrounded by family who truly see me for who I am, I find myself reflecting on how a crisis that began with betrayal ultimately led to the most authentic chapter of my life. Last month, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the International Women's Financial Independence Summit, an honor that recognized not just my professional expertise, but the personal journey that has resonated with so many. Standing at that podium, I shared my story not as a tale of family conflict, but as a powerful illustration of how financial foresight creates options when faced with life's unexpected challenges. The hospital revelation wasn't the end of our story, I told the audience of financial professionals and private clients. It was merely the beginning of a more honest chapter, one where appearances finally gave way to substance. The consulting arrangement with Westridge Financial has flourished beyond what any of us anticipated. What began as occasional advisory sessions has evolved into a specialized division focused on international asset protection for clients seeking security beyond status. Robert and I co-lead this division, our complementary expertise creating a service unique in the marketplace. We offer something competitors can't, Robert explained during a recent client presentation. The technical knowledge of current regulations combined with decades of practical experience navigating multiple regulatory environments successfully. This professional collaboration would have been unimaginable 3 years ago, when Robert viewed my financial knowledge as outdated and limited. Now, we regularly present together at industry conferences, with Robert often deferring to my experience on complex international questions while I acknowledge his technical expertise on current regulatory frameworks. It's the mother-son team that's revolutionizing how we think about privacy-focused wealth management, wrote Financial Advisor magazine in a recent profile. The article, framed on my office wall, represents a public validation I never sought, but nevertheless find deeply satisfying. More meaningful than professional recognition, however, has been the transformation in our personal relationships. The monthly family dinners that began as tentative efforts at reconciliation have evolved into cherished traditions. Each gathering features genuine conversations where my experiences and insights are actively sought rather than politely tolerated. Alexandra, once dismissive of my modest lifestyle choices, has become perhaps my most dedicated student in financial philosophy. Her transformation has been particularly remarkable given her background of generational wealth and status consciousness. I used to think financial sophistication meant knowing which luxury brands signaled the right status, she confided during a recent lunch. Now I understand it's about creating structures that withstand uncertainty and preserve autonomy regardless of external circumstances. This shift in perspective hasn't just changed her attitude toward me, it's transformed her approach to managing her family's resources and her relationship with her own parents, whose focus on appearances now strikes her as increasingly hollow. Last Christmas, Robert surprised me with a specially commissioned painting of my grandmother's import-export business, based on an old photograph I had preserved. "Where it all began," read the inscription, "with gratitude for the wisdom that protected 3 generations and counting." This acknowledgement of my family's true financial history, not just the parts that conform to conventional success narratives, represented a profound shift in understanding. My worth was no longer measured by the property I owned or the lifestyle I projected, but by the wisdom accumulated through decades of experience and the resilience demonstrated throughout my life. The most significant development, however, has been in my relationship with little Grace, now approaching her 2nd birthday. Unlike most grandparents who simply spoil their grandchildren with visible gifts, I've been entrusted with a different role, teaching her the financial principles that have protected our family across generations. "We want her to learn from you, directly," Robert explained when they asked me to be specifically involved in this aspect of Grace's upbringing. Not just the technical aspects of financial management, but the philosophy behind it, the values and priorities that guided your decisions. To facilitate this unusual education, we established a special tradition. On the first Sunday of each month, I spend the afternoon with Grace in what we playfully call Grandma's Wisdom Sessions. While she's far too young to understand financial concepts now, these gatherings establish a foundation for future learning while creating precious bonds between us. During these sessions, I often tell simplified stories about my grandmother running her business from our front porch, emphasizing themes of independence, resourcefulness, and strategic thinking that she'll gradually understand as she grows. Robert and Alexandra occasionally join these sessions, creating a multi-generational transmission of values that extends beyond mere financial principles. "We're not just teaching her about money," Alexandra observed during one such gathering. "We're teaching her about autonomy, dignity, and self-determination, values that apply across all aspects of life." 6 months ago, I made a decision that surprised my family. I sold my modest house and purchased a beautiful garden apartment in a secure building near the cultural district. The move wasn't prompted by health concerns or pressure from others, but by my own strategic assessment of future needs and preferences. "I don't need that particular house to maintain my independence," I explained when they expressed surprise. "What matters is making choices that maximize both my quality of life and long-term security." Robert's response revealed how completely our dynamic had evolved. "You're doing exactly what you've always taught us," he observed, "making financial decisions based on actual needs and values rather than emotional attachments or appearances." The apartment, with its museum-quality art and thoughtfully selected furnishings, reflects a subtle but significant shift in my own approach. Having established unquestioned financial security and genuine respect, I've allowed myself more visible comfort than I previously permitted, not as status signals, but as authentic expressions of lifelong interests now freely enjoyed. "You've earned this," Janet remarked during the housewarming gathering, surveying the elegant space with its panoramic city views. "Not just financially, but in having created relationships where you no longer need to hide your resources to protect them." This observation captured precisely what had changed. My offshore accounts, originally established for protection against vulnerability, had served their purpose during my illness. Now, having transformed my relationship with Robert from potential exploitation to genuine respect, I could enjoy my resources more openly without fear of manipulation or control. The financial structures themselves continue to evolve. Last quarter, Robert and I worked together to modernize my offshore holdings to align with current regulatory environments while maintaining their core protective features. This collaboration represented the ultimate role reversal, my son helping refine the very structures he once knew nothing about, not to control them but to ensure their continued effectiveness. "It's fascinating to apply current technical knowledge to structures with such proven resilience," he commented during one of our working sessions. "Most of our clients have to build these protections from scratch, without the benefit of decades of successful implementation." This evolution extends to the financial foundation established for Grace. What began as a modest safety net has developed into a comprehensive educational structure. Rather than simply accumulating resources for her future use, we've designed a program that gradually introduces her to financial concepts as she grows, with small practical experiences paired with increasing knowledge about the resources being preserved for her adult life. "She'll understand the why before she controls the what," Alexandra explained to her confused parents when they asked why Grace wouldn't simply receive a traditional trust fund. "Financial responsibility comes from understanding purpose, not just managing mechanics." Perhaps the most meaningful change has been in how I view my own story. For years, I maintained financial privacy primarily as a defensive measure, protection against potential exploitation like I had experienced with Edward. The offshore accounts represented security through secrecy, value hidden from potential threats. Now, having weathered the crisis with Robert and emerged into this new chapter of authentic relationship, I've come to see those same resources differently, not just as protection against threats, but as foundations for creating the life I truly want on my own terms. This shift from defensive to affirmative financial thinking emerged gradually, but has transformed how I approach my third act. At 67, I'm engaged in work I find meaningful, relationships based on genuine respect, and planning a future that excites rather than concerns me. Last week, I finalized arrangements for something I've long contemplated but never pursued: an extended visit to Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and Zurich to personally meet the financial teams who have managed portions of my offshore accounts for decades. This 3-month journey, scheduled to begin next spring, represents both a professional validation and personal adventure that would have seemed impossible during my years of determined financial privacy. Most clients never see the actual infrastructure, protecting their assets, my Singapore account manager noted when I proposed the visit. Meeting you in person after 2 decades of correspondence will be a highlight of my career. Robert and Alexandra have enthusiastically supported this plan, even suggesting they might join me for portions of the journey with Grace. She's too young to remember it, Robert acknowledged, but there's something powerful about her physically being in these places that have been so consequential to our family's security. As I celebrate my birthday today, I realize the greatest gift wasn't preserving my financial independence during illness, though that certainly proved essential. The true gift was discovering that financial independence could serve as a pathway to more authentic relationships once properly understood and respected. My son once took my credit cards when I got sick, never suspecting I had built substantial offshore accounts over decades. That confrontation could have permanently damaged our relationship. Instead, it became the catalyst for something neither of us could have anticipated: a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared values, extending now across 3 generations. If there's one lesson I hope others take from my story, it's this: financial independence isn't merely about accumulating assets. It's about creating options that allow you to maintain dignity and autonomy, even in vulnerable moments. The ultimate expression of that independence isn't necessarily keeping wealth hidden, but having the security to reveal it on your own terms, when it serves your true purposes. The offshore accounts that once represented necessary protection now serve as foundations for new possibilities. The financial privacy that once shielded vulnerability now enables authentic legacy building. The wisdom from my grandmother that helped me weather a betrayal now guides a new generation toward genuine financial independence. 2 years ago, when I revealed those bank statements in my living room, I couldn't have imagined the journey that revelation would initiate. I was simply protecting what I had built. But that moment of defensive revelation ultimately created something far more valuable than the accounts themselves: relationships built on truth rather than assumptions, respect rather than control, and shared wisdom rather than imposed limitations. 5. Years have passed since the day I revealed my offshore accounts to my son. Today, as I celebrate my 70th birthday surrounded by 3 generations of family in the garden of my elegant apartment, I can't help but marvel at how a moment of crisis transformed into the most rewarding chapter of my life. Last week, I received notification of an honor I never would have imagined possible: induction into the International Financial Advisors Hall of Excellence for my pioneering work in privacy-focused asset protection. The award ceremony, scheduled for next month in Zurich, represents the ultimate professional validation of strategies I developed quietly over decades without seeking recognition. Your innovative approaches to cross-jurisdictional asset protection have influenced an entire generation of financial professionals, read the notification letter. More importantly, your willingness to share this expertise after decades of private implementation has created a valuable bridge between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The nomination had come from an unexpected source: Eleanor Winters, the managing partner at Westridge Financial, who had initially been skeptical about bringing in Robert's mother as a consultant. After witnessing the transformative impact of my approach on their international client division, she had become one of my strongest professional advocates. What began as a limited consulting arrangement has evolved into something far more significant. The International Asset Protection Division that Robert and I established at Westridge has grown to become the firm's most distinctive and profitable service offering, with a waiting list of high-net-worth clients seeking our specialized expertise. "We've created something unique in the marketplace," Robert observed during our recent quarterly strategy meeting. Other firms offer offshore services or privacy structures, but none combine your decades of practical implementation with our Technical Compliance Framework. This professional partnership would have seemed impossible 5 years ago when Robert viewed my financial knowledge as outdated and limited. Now, we regularly co-author articles for major financial publications, present at international conferences, and are completing a book titled Privacy as Protection: The Strategic Approach to Wealth Preservation, scheduled for publication next year. More meaningful than professional success, however, has been watching our family's transformation extend to its newest members. Grace, now approaching her 6th birthday, has already absorbed financial concepts that most adults never grasp. Our monthly Grandma's Wisdom sessions have evolved from simple stories to practical exercises appropriate for her age, learning to distinguish between wants and needs, understanding delayed gratification, and recognizing the difference between what others can see and what provides actual security. Grandma, is this a status purchase or a value purchase? She asked earnestly, while shopping with Alexandra last month, applying the framework we had discussed to a particularly expensive toy. This fundamental question, distinguishing between acquisitions that signal status versus those that provide actual value, has become something of a family mantra, transforming how all of us approach consumption decisions. When Grace's brother, James, was born 3 years ago, Robert and Alexandra immediately established the same carefully structured financial foundation for him, ensuring both children would grow up with equal resources and education. Unlike traditional family wealth structures that often create competition between siblings, our approach emphasizes collaborative financial literacy with individual security. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation has been in Alexandra. The status-conscious woman who once subtly dismissed my financial knowledge has become a passionate advocate for financial independence among her social circle, particularly for women. I've watched too many friends remain in unhappy marriages because they lack independent financial structures, she explained during a dinner party last year. Catherine showed me that true freedom comes from resources that remain entirely under your control, especially during vulnerable periods. This perspective has not only changed her approach to family finances, but has strained her relationship with her own parents, who continue to view wealth primarily as a means of displaying status. Their confusion over Alexandra and Robert's decision to live below their means while building substantial security structures reflects the generational divide that my story has helped bridge in our own family. My international travels have expanded beyond the initial visits to my offshore banking centers. Over the past 3 years, I've visited 14 countries, often combining professional speaking engagements with personal exploration. At 70, I'm more adventurous and engaged with the world than I was at 50, a freedom made possible by both financial security and authentic family relationships. You've completely redefined what retirement can look like, Janet observed during our monthly lunch last week. Most people your age are slowing down, but you're having the most dynamic chapter of your life. She's right. My 70s have brought a vibrant mix of professional engagement, family connection, and personal adventure that would have seemed impossible during the years I spent focused on building security and raising Robert alone. Last summer, I did something I never imagined I would do. I took Robert, Alexandra, and the children on a month-long financial foundations tour to the countries where I had established my original offshore structures. In Singapore, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland, we met with my long-term financial managers, toured the institutions that had protected my assets for decades, and discussed how these structures would transition to benefit future generations. This isn't just about money, I explained to Grace as we stood outside the gleaming headquarters of my Swiss banking partner. It's about the freedom to make choices based on what you truly value rather than what others expect. While Grace was too young to fully grasp the technical aspects of international finance, the physical experience of visiting these places established a foundation for deeper understanding as she grows. More importantly, it created a shared family narrative about financial independence that spans 3 generations. Robert's transformation has been particularly meaningful to witness. The son who once dismissed my financial knowledge as outdated now regularly seeks my perspective on complex client situations. The financial advisor who tried to control my assets during illness now advocates fiercely for client autonomy, particularly for older women facing health challenges. I've completely reversed my approach with elderly clients, he acknowledged during a recent professional development workshop we conducted together. Instead of assuming declining capacity, I now focus on creating structures that preserve independence and dignity regardless of future health challenges. This perspective has made him something of a maverick in traditional wealth management circles, where the default approach often involves transferring control to adult children when parents face health issues. His willingness to challenge these conventions, informed by our personal experience, has attracted clients specifically seeking protection against well-meaning but controlling family members. 3 years ago, Robert and Alexandra made a decision that reflected how completely they had absorbed the principles behind my offshore accounts. They established their own international asset protection structures, not replicas of mine, which had been created in a different regulatory era, but modern versions built on the same core philosophy of privacy, autonomy, and security beyond any single jurisdiction's vulnerabilities. We realize that the principles you applied decades ago have become even more relevant in today's uncertain global environment, Robert explained when they shared this decision. Not for tax advantages or concealment, but for the fundamental security that comes from diversification across political and economic systems. This evolution in their thinking represented the ultimate validation of the approach I had quietly implemented decades earlier. What began as my defensive response to Edward's financial betrayal had become a multi-generational strategy for preserving not just assets, but freedom of choice and action. Perhaps the most profound change has been in how I view my own financial journey. For decades, I maintained offshore accounts primarily as protection against vulnerability, a defensive measure born from painful experience. My modest lifestyle, despite significant means, was similarly protective, avoiding attention that might threaten my carefully constructed security. Now, having weathered the crisis with Robert and emerged into this authentic chapter of my life, I've come to see those same resources differently, not just as shields against potential threats, but as foundations for creating the life I truly desire on my own terms. This shift from defensive to affirmative financial thinking has transformed how I approach this stage of life. At 70, I maintain the same careful financial structures, but I use them with greater confidence and openness. My apartment reflects thoughtfully chosen quality rather than deliberate modesty. My travel is undertaken for pleasure and connection rather than hidden necessity. My professional engagement comes from genuine interest rather than economic requirement. Most importantly, I no longer feel the need to conceal my financial knowledge or resources from those closest to me. The offshore accounts that once represented necessary secrets now serve as teaching tools for the next generations. The financial privacy that once shielded vulnerability now enables legacy building across decades and borders. Last month, I finalized my most significant financial decision in years, the establishment of the Reynolds Financial Independence Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to teaching financial privacy and protection strategies to vulnerable populations, particularly women leaving difficult relationships and seniors facing potential family control issues. This foundation embodies everything we've learned through our family journey, Robert said at the private launch event. That financial independence isn't just about wealth. It's about maintaining control of your resources when you're most vulnerable. The foundation will offer both education and direct assistance, helping people establish appropriate financial structures before they face crises that might compromise their autonomy. While the scale is modest compared to major philanthropic organizations, its focused mission addresses a need I understand from personal experience. "You've created the perfect legacy," Patricia observed at the launch, the attorney who had helped structure my offshore accounts decades ago and who now serves on the foundation's advisory board. Not just passing on assets, but passing on the knowledge that protects those assets when they're most at risk. As I look around at my 70th birthday celebration today, at Robert, who now respects rather than dismisses my expertise, at Alexandra, who values security over status, at Grace and James, who are learning financial principles I had to discover through painful experience, I realize that my offshore accounts ultimately provided value far beyond financial security. They became the catalyst for rebuilding my relationship with my son on a foundation of genuine respect rather than patronizing concern. They created an opportunity for Alexandra to question the wealth values she had absorbed from her family. They established a financial philosophy that will protect my grandchildren's autonomy throughout their lives. My grandmother's wisdom about keeping something in reserve had proven prophetic in ways neither of us could have imagined when she taught me bookkeeping on our front porch decades ago. The financial privacy she advocated protected not just my assets during illness, but ultimately my dignity and autonomy when most vulnerable. More importantly, her principles have now transcended their defensive origins to become affirmative tools for 3 generations of our family. What began as protection against financial betrayal has evolved into a comprehensive philosophy about the true purpose of wealth. Not status or consumption, but the freedom to make authentic choices, regardless of external pressures or expectations. 5. Years ago, when I revealed those offshore account statements in my living room, I couldn't have imagined the journey that revelation would initiate. I was simply defending what I had built against my son's well-intentioned but controlling actions. That moment of crisis, however, ultimately created something far more valuable than the accounts themselves: relationships built on truth rather than assumptions, respect rather than control, and shared wisdom rather than imposed limitations. My son once took my credit cards when I got sick, never suspecting I had built substantial offshore accounts over decades. That confrontation could have permanently damaged our relationship. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most rewarding chapter of my life. A chapter defined not by hidden wealth, but by revealed wisdom. Not by defensive secrecy, but by affirmative legacy building across generations. If there's one final lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this: financial independence creates not just security, but the foundation for authentic living. The offshore accounts that protected me during illness ultimately enabled the most honest and rewarding relationships of my life. What began as necessary protection became the platform for my greatest contributions. To my family, my profession, and now through the foundation, to others facing similar vulnerabilities. As I blow out 70 candles today, surrounded by family who truly see and respect me, I realize that the ultimate victory wasn't keeping my assets safe from my son's control. It was transforming that conflict into a multi-generational legacy of financial wisdom that will protect my family's autonomy and choices long after I'm gone.